1-2. Warmachine is a futuristic steampunk miniatures game which you might compare to something like Warhammer 40,000. I got my grubby mitts on the Warmachine 2-player starter set, and I wanted to take a closer look at the minis, the plastic, and to paint one of them up and see how it compared to Warhammer. Honestly, I think Warhammer could learn a thing or two from Steamforged games here. I also painted up one of the minis in a probably rather insane and almost certainly lore inaccurate colour scheme, but I'm not deep into that ecosystem or lore, so just let me paint my little toys however I want, okay? Let's just get to it, because I know you're staring at this spot. I normally reserve anything steampunk for that same loathsome space as the least likeable music ever, electro swing, and the world's most unobtrusive yet irritating hobby, contact juggling. It's sort of obliviously trying to be down with the kids, but usually failing pretty successfully, ending up demoted to 90s era nonsense nostalgia like unintentionally shit Instagram filter style 35mm cameras for kids who don't understand eBay, or unironically building your own computer keyboard. That said, Warmachine manages to elevate itself out of that hellhole, because not only is it reasonably light on the steampunk, at least for half of this starter set, but also because even the futuristic pirate models are actually pretty dynamic and don't seem to fall victim to the unabashedly janky stick cogs on it and call it done typical steampunk trope. The starter set itself is secretly not really a starter set, since although you get the minis, you do need to have 3 D6s, a tape measure or other measuring device. I suspect they mean a ruler and not just your fingers, and what they refer to as a handful of tokens, which I like because it's fairly nondescript, and so you could use anything from literal gold nuggets to buttons you found in the alley while begging, you absolute tramp. But fuck all that, I'm more into painting miniatures than playing the games, so if you came here for a game review you should probably look elsewhere. Do keep watching, however, because I need the YouTube juice. Let's talk about the miniatures. So, Warmachine was originally started back in 2003 by American company Privateer Press, who are now rounding out 2024, their 25th year in business. However, in June of this year they announced that Steamforged Games would be taking over Warmachine in addition to their Formula P3 paint and their Iron Kingdoms brands. The Iron Kingdoms is where Warmachine is set. You'll know Steamforged for a number of things, I suspect, including the Epic Encounters boxes, one of which I did a little video on a few weeks ago. So since the middle of the year, Steamforged have been treading rather carefully into Warmachine, with all the caution and trepidation you'd expect from someone trying to bolster a 20-year-old community who probably have various unwritten rules and expectations in place. Now, I can't speak for those who have been at it for 20 years, but I can say rather confidently that this box is really nicely put together. And when I say that, I mean the minis. The actual box is just cardboard, so it's put together exactly as you'd expect. But the injection moulded plastic sprues are rather nice. The plastic is high impact polystyrene, or HIPS, which means no dicking about with white metal either, and that's a win for me. Something of a sidestep to Warhammer, they make several improvements with their sprue setup in my opinion. Firstly, the sprues are denoted with both letters and numbers. Looking for all the parts for A1 to A10? Well, they're all on the same sprue. Good for your mental health, and also great if you're reselling individually on eBay. Not that I'd condone such a thing. Secondly, if you cut them off and arrange them in order, you pretty much assemble them consecutively, so even without instructions, which we will come to, they're not too difficult to understand when you stick number 1 to number 2, number 3 to number 4, and so on. Thirdly, even if you can't count, or you clip the bits off and spang them all over your table, not realising that there's an order to things, you'll still be fine, because even where bits are basically the same shape, you can't get them wrong. Steamforged have very cleverly engineered the minis to have quite specific holes and nodules, or keys, or little nubs, or whatever you want to call them. This means sticking parts together is pretty smooth sailing, and dare I say it, almost enjoyable. And that's coming from someone who would rather stick a Swan Norton size 10 blade in their eye than build a full squad of anything. Still, In the interest of deciding which mini I wanted to paint, I cleaned up the lot of these and put them all together aside from a few shields, which I left off just in case. Oh, and fourthly, if that's a word, they have given you a QR code or a URL or just a link on the website to the build instructions. So instead of having endless amounts of recycling to do, you can just call up the building instructions on your phone, not call up like phone them, call up like bring them up, or on a computer and follow them. One amusing thing that did happen was I spent a while building the first miniature in the instructions just by looking at the exploded diagram view, not realising that the actual steps were below. So when I finished that mini and scrolled down expecting the next one, I was like, oh, okay, now you're ready to assemble. So yeah, lessons learned there. A couple of the minis also have options. Just a minor detail, but there are pistols with smoke and a blast effect, as well as a missile being fired from the bazooka guy too. I opted to build without the effects, but it's nice to have the choice. In terms of cleanup, there were the usual mould lines, but to be honest, I rattled through them and none of them were super offensive. Generally, I suspect the manufacturing process has been dialed in quite nicely, so yes, some cleanup, but really no more than I've had to do with the Warhammer build. So what do the minis look like? Well, you get two teams and a little bit of scatter terrain in the form of a couple of ponds and some walls. Team-wise, there's a sort of punchy, close combat blastery one, who are bulky and have shields and stuff. They're called Cador or Kador. And then you get a blue team who are basically more versatile, shooty space pirates, and they're called Signar. Each has a warjack, or like a big guy. I left the shield off this one, and then you've got a shielded kind of chunky warrior. You've got another one of them in a different pose, and you've got a third one with a heavy weapon. I suspect they all have names, but I have not bothered to learn them. They have a bazooka guy too, and a sort of fancy axe warrior who, when you're putting him together or her together, they needed a bit of care and attention since there was a small mistake in the build instructions with this front tabard piece, although I did let Steamforged know about that, so we should be fine. For the Signar team, you have this chunky warjack fella with a gun and a sort of punchy fist spike thing. Then you've got a double pistoled captainy looking woman with high-heeled boots. There's a second double piston wielding cloaky fella, and then a running hatted guy who has a pistol and a knife. And then you've got this beefier looking chap with a stubby shotgun type weapon and a sick ponytail. And you've got a sniper type fella too. So I'm going to paint up this chunky boy with his shield. I like the sculpt and I think it should be reasonably simple to paint, nothing too fiddly. First up, I stuck him on a cork and I pinned the shield to another cork, and then using AK Interactive Matte Black Primer and Citadel Grey Sear, I did a Zenithal Prime to pick out the detail and just to give me a bit of pre-shading. Now, for a while I've been wanting to try a mad colour scheme, and so I decided I'd try for like a laser yellow scheme for this fella. My feeling was it wouldn't offend any Warmachine players, hopefully, and it might be something a bit different for anybody wanting to try this sort of thing. The colours used here were pistachio, laser yellow and good old ice yellow. The greeny yellows would make up the bulk of the mini, while that ice yellow would be reasonably light for the edge highlights. So I just set about painting that on the mini like it was going out of fashion. I was approaching this with very little plan, to be honest. I figured that I'd sort of find the panels as I explored the painting process, and I guess it's a little like what you might do with a test miniature for any sort of colour scheme that you're looking to try. The difference here, of course, and this is especially highlighted at this scale as opposed to 75mm or busts, is not knowing what bits are what. So I've not really lived with these minis. I've not got a clear grasp of the elements of their uniforms, armour, or what piece is what, and I purposefully didn't spend a long time studying the box art for colour schemes. Warmachine obviously isn't as big as, say, Warhammer 40,000, and so instead of painting Space Marines and being all like, oh, I know exactly what that is, it's a shoulder pad, it's an eye lens, it's a backpack, I was realising things as I went along here, like, oh right, that's a cloak, or he's wearing gloves, and so on. Anyway, I got a fairly solid base of pistachio down, but of course 2 coats were needed for reasonable coverage, especially with this being a lighter colour, even over a light grey primer. After 2 coats, I was happier with the outcome, so I figured I'd move on to the laser yellow. Now the jump between these 2 colours is not all that big if I'm honest, which is good if we're blending or working up highlights. But here, I was maybe hoping for a bit more of a delineation between the 2 colours, so later I went in with some shading to aid that, but for now a couple of coats of this laser yellow just on things like armour trim and rims and stuff would do the trick. I think when you're doing this sort of paint job, picking things out and coating them then edge highlighting, it's important to get good coverage with your paints. Now that often means more than 1 coat, and for beginners I think it's good to remember that even when the paint is going on in what feels like a thin coat, when you get to that 2nd or 3rd coat, you'll already start to see a big difference. And the reality is that a number of thinner coats will cover better than a single thick coat in many cases. Not always, there's always an exception, but in most cases. Next up, I used the ice yellow to pick out the edges. Now, this wasn't every single edge, but a lot of them, and definitely all the upward facing ones. Edge highlighting is something that you'll want to practice plenty, and it really helps to have steady hands and to brace them well. I have a size 0 brush here, and I almost always use my pinky to brace against either the model, the bit of cork, or my other hand. Once I had that done, I realised I needed to darken the recesses and the spots between the 2 yellow colours. So I picked up Camouflage Green. This is a dark green, as you can see. I've got my palette in view here now so that you can see what I'm doing in terms of dilution. But basically I put a couple of big brush loads worth of water onto the palette, so there's a stack of water there, and I add a small bit of green to it a couple of times until it ends up as this kind of wash consistency. Now, I make sure to wash my brush off, and then I go back and pick up a controlled amount with the brush in order to put that carefully onto the recesses and then along the corners. Now in some places this felt reasonably easy to do since there were almost channels and places where that colour could pool comfortably, but in other areas it was just a case of being extra careful, and if you're doing this sort of thing there's no shame in going back when it's dry for either another coat or to do a bunch of cleanup with the previous colours if you've gone over into the panels or areas that you didn't want to. When you see this dried, it's really probably quite a subtle effect, but it all helps with building that contrast. Next, I figured that I'd slap on some metal. I decided that although I do love my Vallejo metal colour, there are a number of good metallic paints that AK do in their full range, and since I am a full range wanker, I should probably at the very least check some of them out. Burnt tin was actually one I'd used already, so that was an easy choice to start with. That yellowy browny metal complementing the yellowy green of the armour here. Colour scheme wise, this kept us in reasonably warm tones, and that burnt tin is dark enough that it can be highlighted easily with something like copper to bring up that orangey warm tone. We're not going too gold here since I think that would end up too close to the yellow, but having the copper here just brightens the dark tin enough to stop it looking too dirty. As an edge highlight, I thought I'd try the AK Silver. It's particularly bright, but I think as an edge colour only it'll hold up, and generally when you paint gold you can safely paint the edges in silver anyway. The brightness and how close the light is to white ends up looking a bit more realistic than trying to find a super light gold colour. The silver also lends an air of slightly tarnished look to it too, almost like the gold is rubbing off. Also worth noting here with metals is if you do go too light, you can always wash them back further down the line. I decided here that I wanted to just fill in some of the black parts like the cloth and gloves and so on, so instead of using black paint I picked up contrast black Templar. It's dark enough to be almost black but transparent enough to let some of that pre-shaded zenithal primer come through in the relevant areas. When that was dry, I figured I'd do the leather pouches. Now to keep them simple, I figured I'd just run with a couple of colours. The first was Redskin Shadow, which is one of AK's colour punch range, nice and bold and pigmented. This went on the leather spots and the gun handles and in a few other areas. While I was getting a few more base colours down, I went in with Vallejo metal colour Gunmetal Grey, largely because AK don't have a super dark metal like Leadbelcher, or at least not one that I could see, and I didn't want to dilute their metals with any black in here. So this was used for all the other metal parts remaining: goggles, bits around the eyes, tubing, bullets, gun parts, and so on. After that, it was a case of catching all the metal with a coat of Nuln Oil to dull the metals and to fill those recesses with darkness. While that was drying, I used AK Tan Earth to edge highlight all the brown leather areas. Now, a lot of good painting can be done by understanding which parts are drying and working on other parts while that happens. You can build out a pretty efficient process on a single model, or if you're batching, of course, by the time you've done your 5th or your 10th model in that same colour, the first one will be dry enough for the next part. So really after that, there was very little else to do besides the base texture paint, wash and dry brush, which was Astrogranite, and then the rim, which I ended up doing in black. So there we have the final result. It's pretty day glow, and the scheme might not be for everyone, but it was nice to scratch that itch on something that wasn't a Space Marine, and I can definitely recommend the Warmachine starter set if you feel like you'd like to give it a go. So if for a second you forget that this isn't Warhammer, and you just imagine that we've painted up like a Space Marine, an Imperial Guard or an Astra Militarum Ogryn, and apart from moaning about the Dayglow scheme, I imagine we'd be pretty chuffed, right? So do we feel the same knowing that we got here without Warhammer at all? I think so. I'm not bashing Warhammer because I love it, and I'm happy to continue painting up all those Space Marines anyway, but I love that I can find miniatures that feel as good quality-wise from a supplier who are far smaller, so that if there is a lull in Warhammer releases, which I highly doubt, or they're going to town on like Emperor Children or something that's of no interest to me, then I can get stuck into some Warmachine minis instead and have an equally enjoyable time. Was this interesting or useful? Who knows? Let me know in the comments what you thought. Unless you thought it was shit, in which case, why are you still watching? As ever, it's free to like and subscribe, and it helps me get these videos out to more people. If you want to share your own minis or get some feedback on your painting, you can join the Discord linked in the description below. And if you want any more information about Warmachine or any of the Steamforged games, then you can get that from their website, which I've also linked in the video description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. #Warmachine.